Good morning. This is Professor David Weiss from New Jersey City University's Institute for Dispute Resolution and its Connecting Bridges and Borders program series that continues on podcast on various global business and global affairs topics. Today we have Professor Zoltan Feher, who is currently at Tufts University and also completing his PhD at the Fletcher School of Law and Policy. Diplomacy, yes. Thank you, Professor. And he concentrates in realpolitik with a centered focus on relationships. And I want to welcome you to the show today. How are you?
Great. Thank you, Professor Weiss. Thank you, David, for having me on the show.
So let's start out a little bit with your background so that our viewers have a little bit of perspective on understanding your global academic scholarly concentration.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Great to be on the show. My background is in diplomacy. I like to say that I'm a diplomat-scholar in the noble tradition of role models, Henry Kissinger, George Kennan, and the likes of them. I worked for the Hungarian government as a professional diplomat for 12 years. And most recently, I served as an acting ambassador for Hungary in Ankara, Turkey. I'm currently pursuing my PhD in international relations, and I'm also teaching as an adjunct professor at Tufts University. I've also taught at Harvard Kennedy School, Harvard Summer School, and MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and prominent Hungarian universities, ELTE and Poznan.
Well, you certainly have a depth of knowledge both that crosses many borders and many regions. So I'm really excited about our discussion today. So let's just jump right in and talk about a very fascinating article that you recently completed, which I read, dealing with realpolitik and how it relates vis-a-vis COVID-19. And when we're talking about realpolitik, why don't we start out about what is realpolitik? What does that mean so that our viewers understand?
Realpolitik is a long tradition in political affairs and especially international relations, but a lot of the people who are familiar with realpolitik in international relations do not know that it actually originates in domestic politics. It was a concept developed by Ludwig von Rochau, a Prussian liberal activist and scholar and politician later, for viewing domestic politics in a realistic way. So realpolitik comes from domestic politics, but it made its way, especially through Chancellor Bismarck, into the field of international relations. And when the current discipline of international relations developed in the early 20th century, a lot of the scholars, the early scholars, identified this realpolitik tradition going back thousands of years, back to the Greek historian Thucydides and the medieval philosopher Machiavelli. Machiavelli is especially identified with realpolitik because realpolitik holds that every state, and back in Thucydides' time and Machiavelli's time, it was about city-states. Every city-state pursues their own interest. I wanted to say national interest, but back then we talked about city-state interest. Every city-state, every nation-state, every state, every empire pursue their own interests in international politics. And so Rochau started out from identifying what your political forces' interests are and how to go about achieving them. But it's made its way into international politics, and it's been one of the foundational theories in international relations, later named realism.
That's really fascinating because, you know, what it really comes down to, in a very simplistic way of a very complicated conversation, is about the self-interest of a nation state in modern times. So if we are looking at that model, how do we sort of now approach the article that you wrote about COVID-19? Because there's a lot of controversy in regards to the realpolitik actions that have been taken by nation states all over the world. And that argument deals with, of course, on one side, this idea of realpolitik, of that each nation state is sort of serving its own agenda to address the pandemic, accessing resources necessary for that to satisfy its citizens. But at the same time, this is such a large scope issue. Does realpolitik work in this sort of environment?
Right, that's a great question, and I've addressed that in my article. But let me go back a little bit into international relations theory. So the two major theories that have been prominent in international relations are what I identify with realpolitik, but stemmed from realpolitik, what we call realism. It's the same word. Realpolitik is a German word for realistic politics. And the other is idealism or liberalism. And they've been quarreling about whether nations or states or nation states, and I'm going to use that word nation state from now on, because that's what really characterizes today's international environment. These two theories have been quarreling about whether nation states are inherently prone to cooperation or to conflict. And so cooperation, whether they're prone to cooperation, whether they are intrinsically cooperative, has been a subject of this debate for the longest time. And kind of the last or the most recent term of that debate took place from the late 70s, when Kenneth Waltz wrote his theory of international politics and founded a new school or sub-school of realism, neorealism, or what he termed structural realism. And Waltz especially addresses this question. He says, interdependence or integration or cooperation in general will only occur if nation states deem that to be in their interest. And usually they will try to shy away from interdependence, because interdependence actually means dependence of that nation state on other nation states. And so proponents of liberalism, especially the creators of interdependence theory, Joseph Nye and Robert Kahane, around the same time in 1977 came with their theory that states are willing to cooperate more and more, and what they saw, don't forget, all of these theories were the products of their own era. What Nye and Kahane saw in interdependence theory, they saw the world around them, they saw even the superpowers cooperating more and more. And in 78, 79, Kenneth Waltz saw what we call Second Cold War, when the relations between the superpowers were again becoming more and more strained. So Waltz saw a more conflictual environment. Nye and Kahane and Richard Rosecrans, who's also a prominent interdependence theorist, they saw a more cooperative environment. So this debate has been going on for a long time between realists and liberals in different eras. Realism and liberalism have seen many different eras, and they have the different periods named classical realism, neorealism, now neoclassical realism, idealism for liberalism, later neoliberalism as well. So the different sides have been quarreling, and other schools of theories have joined in. But what realpolitik, what realism teaches us, is that nation states will only cooperate if it's in their interest. And that's what I expanded in my article about COVID-19.
And so when we look at these different degrees of friction or interest, how do you see this situation and the actions that have taken place to date playing out currently? And going back to that first question I asked, is this something that is counterproductive to whether you take a perspective of realpolitik or you take the opposite sort of liberalism degree perspective of an interconnected, globalized society? Maybe perhaps we could look at the WHO as an example of
right.
this conversation. How do you see the impact on this?
COVID-19 and the ensuing crisis has been a great example of realpolitik and cooperation and all of these concepts in real-world practice. And my argument is the following, my argument that I laid out in my recent article. Countries of the world have failed to deal with this crisis. We have over 3 million cases today, and hundreds of thousands of people have died. And I believe it's because they haven't cooperated sufficiently enough. But I'm also making the case that this is only natural from a realist point of view, because realism, Realpolitik, teaches us that they will only cooperate, they will only pursue their own interest. And so what I'm arguing in the article is that most nation states of the world, most countries in the world, have used this Realpolitik lens too narrowly. They thought they could deal with this crisis on their own, and they have failed. We have very few good examples: Sweden, New Zealand, Germany, who have dealt with this in a successful way and minimized both those people, the number of people who contracted the virus and also those who have died from it. Most countries, starting from the United States, unfortunately, have not dealt with this crisis very well. And my argument is what we're lacking here is global governance on at least global pandemics. So I'm making this kind of unusual argument that Realpolitik was taken too narrowly, but Realpolitik would have to teach countries that they should cooperate on this because they can't deal with it alone. But they will only cooperate with other countries when they recognize that that is in their interest. And that's what's missing right now from the picture, that they haven't recognized. Plus, the whole thing has ensued very, very rapidly. So that's why there wasn't really a time frame for cooperating. But we have to see, we have to draw some lessons for the future, obviously.
Well, let's get a little bit more micro level on this issue. Sure. So if we're looking at the United States as a part of this case study on Realpolitik, one of the sort of synergies I'm hearing and listening to you speak is that the way that we inside the United States have been handling this is somewhat of a Realpolitik model as well, where we've allowed states to sort of pin themselves against each other for resources, and have almost created a self-interest within the state, within the country itself. So how do you sort of, from your lens and what you've written about, how can one of the large superpowers, which has a major footprint on how we would combat COVID-19, play in the international space of Realpolitik or liberalism, depending on which way this doctrine wants to go, if currently its position inside its house, inside the nation state, is one in which it has already created a mechanism that is pinning states against each other within what we call these United States. Where do you see that playing out in terms of this more global issue in order to get to a place of cooperation or collaboration?
Right. So in international relations, we work with the concept or work with the lens of levels of analysis. And one of the problems for a long time in our field was that each scholar would look at one level of analysis. It's useful to identify which level of analysis you're looking at, but it might not be useful to look at only one. Levels of analysis are individual levels, so people, even leaders, then the level of the state. State here means the country and its government, but it encompasses also the populace. And the highest level is the international system. So scholars used to look at one level, just the international system or just the state. And then the field evolved and we started seeing that we're missing out on a lot of the truths that we want to uncover because we're too blind to levels of analysis that are outside our purview. I think that's what's happening, and that's why I wrote this. I'm an international relations specialist, but I can't overlook what's happening inside. That's another term that we use in our field a black box, because for realists, it was always the international system, especially from structuralism, so the past 40 years, it was mostly the international system that mattered, and they looked at the state as kind of a uniform phenomenon. Kenneth Waltz calls them, like units, the states. And realists didn't used to look inside, that black box. And then liberals would look inside the black box, but they would be overly preoccupied with what's going inside states, what's going inside domestic politics. And they would, claim that domestic politics really determines foreign policy. But it's obviously not that simple. So when I'm writing in the article is both about international politics, but I'm also looking into the black box of states. And what I found, and you correctly pointed out, that I found almost a Realpolitik scenario within the United States. My claim is what happens inside the black box of states really matters for international politics. One of the things I've been working on is U.S. China competition, especially U.S. strategy towards China the past 50 years. That's my main research project. And obviously the big question is, who's going to win this competition? This is now the determining most prominent geopolitical competition of the 21st century between the United States and China. And the question that is on everyone's mind is who's going to win it? Well, my answer is whoever is going to fare better, not just in external policy, but in internal policy. So what we've seen with the United States during COVID-19 is there's this fragmentation of governance levels. We have the federal government, we have state governments, we have local governments. They're very siloed. The federal government has the money. They often don't have the authority. For example, about lockdowns and stay-at-home orders. They can provide advisory through the CDC, but they don't have an overall federal authority about a national emergency. They can declare a national emergency, but that will mostly have budgetary implications, what they can do with the federal budget. Then we have the state governments, especially the governors, who have limited budgets, so they really are dependent on the federal government, but they have some of the authority, not all of the authority, but some of the authority. They can get businesses closed down. Also, one of the problems that I think the United States has faced was that the lockdown, the meaning of the lockdown is not the same here as, for example, in Europe or in Asia, where the lockdowns were rigorously imposed by governments and implemented by, if you needed the police force of each country, where here we're talking about stay-at-home advisories. People are advised to stay at home. They cannot be obligated to stay at home. And then we have the local governments, municipalities, who have even narrower resources and authority. And we've seen a really big disconnect between the different levels, especially a strained relationship between several state governors and the federal government, the president and the White House, often because they are from different parties. So it's taken on a kind of a partisan conflict. As you said, the federal government has budgetary authority. They have a lot of money, a lot of funds. They can also, temporarily nationalize companies, or they can order that certain companies start making, weaponry or in this case, masks and ventilators. But there's been a huge disconnect between, having those masks and ventilators ordered or made or paid for by the federal government and distributing them to the states. So we see a disconnect, and I also talk in the article about U.S. China competition and how COVID-19 has affected it. And my argument that has been my argument for a while, along with people like Joseph Nye or Michael Beckley and others, that the United States can only fare well, only win in this competition if the deep structural problems that are present in the United States in the domestic policy arena are taken care of. And this, what we've just discussed, is one of those.
And that was my question, is that if it becomes the dislocation within a nation state, in this case the United States, which also happens to be a superpower, is trying to find its footing and self-interest within realpolitik against another nation state. In this case, we'll look at the U.S. China perspective now.
Right.
And we're talking beyond the scope of COVID-19, which of course, we can't discount that today. But when we look at sort of longevity of a doctrinal analysis or doctrinal policy of self-interest for economic competition, if we're dislocated in the House, how can we move forward to determine what the clarity is in the agenda that we will then counterface if the other side, in this case China, has a much more cohesive, at least because of its regime structure.
Right.
Currently, it doesn't face an internal dislocation like it did in Tiananmen Square.
Or we're not aware.
Right, exactly. So,
but it's not visible. Yeah, it's nothing's prominent
for the moment, right? But we cannot predict the future. So if we look at just where we are in that black box, as you point out today, what is the United States looking out sort of spatially between 3 and 5 years while it's combating, like the rest of the world, this pandemic issue, the recovery of the pandemic, and whatever fallout occurs as a result of that, not just economically, but public health-wise and other issues that we may not recognize at the moment. How are we to then address this self-interest competition concern, which is really a national security concern, not just for the United States, but for other parts of the world that may have to pick or choose sides when it comes vis-a-vis this U.S. China relationship, or lack thereof?
Right. I mean, we're definitely at a juncture, and I'm bringing in within my article 2 recently published articles by 2 very prominent scholars, Henry Kissinger and Joseph Nye. I've mentioned them both before, and I'm pointing out that I think their articles are also responding to each other, because Kissinger's article is titled "The Coronavirus Will Change World Order Forever," and Joseph Nye's article is titled "No, the Coronavirus Pandemic Will Not Change World Order." But clearly, world order and the competition between the U.S. and China, are on everyone's minds these days, because this is definitely a new phenomenon, and this is a new phase in the U.S.-China competition. And people here, we in the U.S., we're worried that this phase is not, it's not very, the U.S. is not coming out very well from. The pandemic started in China, and we're really not sure about the actual numbers. China is a communist dictatorship and a very non-transparent state, and they have a history of suppressing real information, and also forging numbers, real data, statistics about, for example, the coronavirus pandemic and its victims. The U.S., on the other hand, is a very transparent country, and even though, because of a low level of testing, we're estimating that there's probably more cases that we're currently aware of. But the U.S. has been very transparent about its numbers, and currently we have about these are the registered cases. We have about 1,200,000 people who have contracted the virus, and we have 70,000 deaths in the United States. 70,000 people have died from this virus. So we can say that the U.S. has not dealt with the coronavirus very well. And this is just one area where the U.S. Has shown weakness as of late. And when we look at this in the context of the U.S. China competition, we can see, as you pointed out, China has a lot of advantages that stem from its political and social system. I study strategy, and I can tell you that in strategy, the Chinese have been much better, partly because they have a very closed system in which strategic decision-making is centered on a group of very few people, and final decision-making rests with the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, currently. In America, we have a pluralistic democratic system, both in political decision-making and electoral politics, and in freedom of expression. We have pluralism all across the U.S. And so decision-making, strategic decision-making has had to deal with those limitations in the U.S., and China has an edge over the U.S.
Let me pause you for a second. Let's stay on that very important, I think, comment you just made about the strategy. So if we sort of go back to looking at Kissinger's commentary that you referred to before in your article, that the pandemic has triggered what will become some new structure within the New World Order. And Nyack talks rebuttals about this in terms of his commentary that things are not going to change.
Right.
My as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about now soft diplomacy or soft power.
Right.
Yeah, and the question really is, are they both not wrong? In other words, was this already underway before the pandemic, but rather in terms of the fact that this soft power diplomacy was already implemented and being implemented strategically wise by the Chinese around the world, whether it's in South America, the Caribbean Basin, Europe, Asia, Africa, and where Kissinger and Nyack, I think, are, in my question to you, perhaps could be on the same page, is that the pandemic has just flushed out what may be consciously now something that has been in place even for many years before the pandemic.
Exactly. That is my point. And I actually argue with both of them, and I say that the world order has been changing for a while. It's not the coronavirus that will change the world order, but it will have its influence. Again, my point is about the coronavirus in the context of U.S.-China competition is, even though China's, the virus, as far as we know, and every indication shows that, originated in China, and China is greatly responsible for not halting it within its borders, within Wuhan province's borders, to start with, but within its national borders. And that way, China is primarily responsible for the global pandemic. On the other hand, China, at least according to their official numbers, which are very, very low, both about cases and deaths, China's population has suffered in a fairly limited way compared to the United States. The United States has not dealt with this very well, and the management of the pandemic in the United States actually have brought forth several factors that have been prominent in the U.S.-China competition. Again, my argument is that if the U.S. doesn't do its homework, doesn't do its housekeeping about its structural problems, it will not have a chance of winning this competition. The U.S. needs to get strong internally to be able to be strong externally. And so what I'm seeing right now is, I think China's gotten a big hit because they didn't halt the pandemic within their borders, and they facilitated, unfortunately, inadvertently, unknowingly, the global pandemic, and their reputation has suffered. Even though China's tried to strengthen its soft power, China has traditionally had its soft power as its weakness. Chinese soft power has never been very strong. U.S. soft power, on the other hand, the appeal of the U.S. democratic political system, of rock music, of Hollywood, of genes, everything that we identify with America has had, America has had a very strong soft power for decades. That's partly why America won the Cold War, because its social system, its society, its political system had wide appeal in the world. China's political system or social system or society have never had that. And so China is trying to strengthen its soft power by playing the role of the benevolent superpower. They halted the pandemic within their borders by March, and since then, and even before, they started aiding other countries, for example, Italy, or my own country, Hungary, and other countries in the Central Eastern European region with masks and coronavirus tests, and also ventilators and respirators. That's how China is trying to strengthen its reputation, its soft power, a concept that originates with Joseph Nye. And the US is not doing very well in that regard. First of all, US soft power suffers because the US has not dealt with the coronavirus very successfully. Also, it suffers because the US needs to be preoccupied with halting this pandemic within its borders, and the US has been almost entirely absent from the international scene for the past couple of months, which is also unprecedented in the context of the past century, but it's not unprecedented within the past couple of years. We can see a gradual withdrawal since the Obama administration, but especially during the current Trump administration, a gradual withdrawal of the United States from its former international leadership role. And that's the vacuum that China is trying to fill. So this is a very dangerous game for the United States currently.
And that's I think a way to sort of end this sort of appetizer, maybe even moosh boosh, if you will, of understanding some very, very deep and complicated issues. But I think you've done a great job of explaining it to our viewers that on one end, the United States needs to figure out its realpolitik position inside its house. And then second from that is, once it can figure out its organized game plan, it needs to look at how it's going to revitalize soft power influence around the world. And by doing that, have a strategy of how it's going to compete effectively and economically against China going forward into the next decade or two. And obviously, we'll leave that out there for our viewers to consider, as we on our show are unfiltered and unbiased, and we allow our viewers to take their own information and determine themselves how they feel about these great conversations. Professor, I want to thank you so much for taking your time today and providing us some insight that needs to be digested and really explored and examined over the next 12 to 24 months as we both fight this pandemic, but also as we look at the global world and what the US position will be vis-a-vis its Chinese strategy, as well as how it effectively will work with China or against China as we enter into a new millennium post the pandemic, or a new era. So on that, this is Professor David Weiss signing off again for New Jersey City University's Institute for Dispute Resolution and its continuing programming on connecting bridges and borders. Until our next program, I bid adieu. Be safe and take care.